let's talk about graphing. Now, we have graphed some basic exponential equations, so let's remind ourselves what those looked like. When we graphed basic exponentials, they looked like this. We called it our hockey stick graph. And they always had a vertical asymptote, a horizontal asymptote there. That it had a point right there at 0, 1. And they had a point up here at 1, the base. So that was something we've talked about in previous lessons about exponentials. Today, we're going to start solving more and more complicated exponential problems. So let's start by listing all the things we need to graph. Now, this should bring back some deja vu from Chapter 3, where you had to learn all those different rules of graphing. You had to learn X-intercept, Y-intercept, vertical asymptotes, holes, domain, all those different rules you had to memorize to graph rational functions. Now, you don't have nearly as many rules to memorize for exponentials, thank goodness, and the best thing is some of those rules are actually going to carry over. So here's what we need to find for exponentials. First up, we do still need to find the domain. We don't need to find holes. We don't need to worry about any holes for exponentials this time. We will need to find x-intercepts and y-intercepts. And the last thing we need to find is asymptotes. Now, in the next lesson, in 4.4, we're going to be talking about solving logarithmic equations. Graphing more complicated logarithmic equations. Today we're graphing more complicated exponential equations. Now, because the logarithmic graph and the exponential graph do look very different, they are going to have slightly different rules. So for today's lesson, let's just focus on the graphing exponential rules. So to that end, if we look at this graph, notice my asymptote. Is this exponential graph going to have a vertical asymptote or a horizontal asymptote? Definitely a horizontal asymptote. So if the equation you're graphing is an exponential, it's going to have a horizontal asymptote. If it's a logarithm, it's actually going to have a vertical asymptote. Next thing I notice, looking at this graph, do you see the domain is everything? This graph goes forever to the left, and it goes forever to the right. So my domain is -infinity to infinity. And that will actually hold true for all of your exponentials. So next thing we have are the x and y intercepts and actually finding the horizontal asymptotes. So let's split this into 3 where we can find all 3 of these things. Let's start with the y-intercept. It's the easiest. Now, if you remember the rule you memorized from Chapter 3, to find the y-intercept, you plug 0 in for x. It's actually the same rule. Sweet! So we're going to take our equation, plug 0 in for x, and when I plug that into my calculator to see what I get that. Now, don't forget to write y-intercepts as 0, that number, because they are a point. So there's our y-intercept. For our x-intercept, remember the rule you memorized was setting the numerator equal to 0. Well, in this problem, there are no denominators. We actually just set the entire equation equal to 0. Whoa. Like that. Now we solve it. You will notice this sure does look a lot like the problems we started class with. So I'm going to add 16, get the exponential by itself. Now I notice 16 is also base 2, so then I can use my 1-to-1 property to get this. Now there are 2 ways you could solve it from here. You could bring the 4 over like that, and get x squared minus 9 and factor using difference of squares. Or you could bring the 5 over, get x squared equals 9, except if you do it this way, you have to remember that anytime you square it, you get plus or minus, and that will give you the same answer either way. So I have 3, 0 and negative 3, 0 are my x-intercepts. Now, last thing, let's talk about finding our horizontal asymptotes. To find our horizontal asymptotes, we're actually going to go back to our inside-outside rules. So a little reminder, inside rules move the graph side to side. Outside rules move the graph up and down. So if I look at this graph, this horizontal asymptote, if I have any inside rules that are going to move this red line side to side, is it actually going to change the line? No, because this line goes forever in either direction. So inside rules will not affect this horizontal asymptote. However, outside rules change things up and down. That will change our horizontal asymptote. So our horizontal asymptote, we're going to look at our outside rules. So I notice in this problem I only have one outside rule, which is minus 16. And that moves the graph down 16. So if I take this horizontal asymptote and move it down 16, I would end up getting y equals negative 16. And that's my horizontal asymptote. So that is how you find all the things you're going to need for graphing. In the next video, we'll actually have you practice finding these things, and then we'll graph it together to talk about how to actually put it all together and fill in a graph.